My mother stood in the airport terminal at 4 in the morning, holding a syringe, smiling at me. "Did you really think we'd trust the pills alone?" she said. "We've been planning this for years." Then she pressed the needle into my neck. That was the last thing I remember before my vision went dark. My 3 sisters were already unconscious on a luggage cart beside me. We were 16, 15, 14, and 13 years old. And in 12 hours, an unlicensed surgeon in Mexico was going to remove our ribs, shave down our cheekbones, and permanently alter our vocal cords, so that we would be physically identical for the rest of our lives. By the end of that morning, my parents were in handcuffs. By the end of that week, the Mexican clinic was under federal investigation. And the single thing that stopped all of it, the one move that changed everything, was a tear. One tear rolling down my face on a luggage cart while I pretended to be unconscious. This is how we got out. I was 6 years old when the measuring started. My youngest sister Ruby was barely 2. Every morning, my mother lined the 4 of us up in the hallway and pulled out a ruler. She measured the length of each of our hair down to the millimeter. If one of us was even slightly off, she cut it right there. No warning. Just scissors. The expectation was that we wouldn't flinch, and we didn't, because we were 6 and 2 and 4 and 7 years old, and this was just what mornings looked like. We were 4 sisters, me, Violet, Hazel, and Ruby, and from that morning forward, we were not permitted to be 4 separate people. We were required to be one. The matching expanded year by year, always gradually, always presented as love. Same clothes every day, same shoes, same posture at the table, same phrases when we spoke to adults. If a teacher called one of us by the wrong name, we weren't allowed to correct them. My parents said it was a gift. They used the word special until it stopped meaning anything. What they never said out loud was what it actually was: control. Total, systematic, years-long control, dressed up in matching pink hoodies and delivered with a smile. There was one rule above all others, never stated but always enforced. If one of us had something the others didn't share, an ability, a physical feature, a personal interest, it had to go. Ruby discovered she could draw when she was 8. She had a gift for faces, the way light falls across a cheek. She drew on everything she could find: notebook margins, napkins, the inside of her arm. My mother found her sketchbook under the mattress and threw it in the trash without a word. Ruby never drew again while we lived in that house. Not because she forgot how. Because she understood, without being told, what happened to things that made her different. The chemical burn started around 8 years old. My parents dyed all of our hair the same shade every 2 weeks. Drugstore dye, harsh formula, applied to growing scalps way too frequently. By the time I was 10, I had open scabs along my hairline that would crust over and reopen every time we dyed again. All of us did. None of us said a word, because mentioning pain was treated as drawing attention to your individuality, and that was the worst thing you could do in our house. I got my period when I was 11. I told no one. Violet hadn't gotten hers yet, and in our house, if one of us had something the others didn't, it had to be concealed until everyone caught up. I used wadded toilet paper for 2 years. 2 years of hiding in bathroom stalls. 2 years of bleeding through my pants in class and sitting perfectly still and pretending nothing was wrong, because asking for pads would mean admitting I was developing differently. The shame of those 2 years lives in me like a stone. Not shame about my body. Shame that I was trained to believe my body was a problem that needed to be hidden. But that particular humiliation? That would turn out to be minor. Keep that in mind. The real crisis started at puberty, because bodies do what bodies do and no parental rule changes biology. Violet developed early. My mother's solution was to bind her chest with ace bandages, pulled so tight that Violet passed out in gym class in front of 30 students. The school called an ambulance. The hospital flagged the injuries. My parents told the doctors it was a muscle wrap, that Violet had anxiety. The doctor documented it as a stress episode and discharged her. Nobody pushed harder. Within a week, my mother was binding Violet's chest again. And then, because Violet's development still couldn't be completely suppressed, my mother made the rest of us wear padded bras to match Violet's forced silhouette. So we would all look identical. I put mine on every morning and thought, this is just what families do. I had nothing to compare it to. Hazel grew 5 inches the summer before junior year. My father's solution was to make her slouch. Everywhere. Always. At the dinner table, in the car, at the grocery store. He monitored her posture the way a guard monitors a cell block. If her back straightened for a second, he corrected her, not gently. This went on for over a year. Hazel started waking up with pain sharp enough to pull her from sleep. She was 15 years old. My parents told her to take ibuprofen and stop exaggerating. The damage accumulating in her spine that year would require years of physical therapy and would never be fully undone. Ruby was the opposite problem. She stayed small, so my parents installed thick platform lifts in all her shoes to add inches she didn't have. Her ankles swelled from the unnatural angle within weeks. Beauty requires sacrifice, my mother said, and that was the end of that conversation. But Ruby's real sacrifice wasn't her ankles. Ruby was extraordinary at violin. By 12, her teacher was writing letters about scholarships, regional programs, a future in music. My parents threw every letter away. If Ruby excelled at something the rest of us couldn't match, she wasn't allowed to do it. So Ruby quit violin. She didn't fight it. She just stopped, and something inside her went quiet right along with the music. Here is something that was happening at the same time, something my parents never knew about until it was too late. I had been keeping a journal. Not a diary, documentation. Dates, times, specific incidents. The exact measurements my mother took. The clinic name I had seen when she left her laptop open for 30 seconds. The surgeon's name. The dollar amount from the wire transfer confirmation she had left on the counter for 45 seconds before putting it away. 45 seconds was enough. I had been building this record for 8 months, hidden in the lining of my mattress, because some part of me understood that the truth needed a witness. And since I had no one to trust, I trusted paper. That journal would eventually help bring down an international criminal network. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The school system had already been trying to send up flares, and failing. A teacher named Ms. Park had taught Ruby in 7th grade and seen her play violin at the winter concert. She spent the following week making calls trying to get Ruby into a city conservatory scholarship program. When she found out Ruby was being homeschooled, she filed a wellness check. The county sent a social worker. My mother answered the door with a smile and a house that had been staged perfectly for exactly this scenario. Books on the table, a lesson plan by the door, for girls in matching clean clothes giving matching measured answers to every question. The social worker documented the visit as unremarkable and left. Ms. Park called twice more. Same response each time. After our case broke open, investigators interviewed her. I knew something was wrong, she said. I did everything the system gave me the ability to do. She asked if Ruby was okay. The investigator told her he couldn't share information about minors in protective custody. She went back to teaching. There is a specific kind of failure that happens when a person does everything right and the system still loses. That is what happened to Ms. Park. It is not the same as looking away. I want to be clear about that. Here is something that was happening quietly in the months before the airport, something my parents never knew about. A teacher named Ms. Park had taught Ruby in 7th grade and had seen her play violin at the winter concert. She had spent the following week making phone calls trying to connect Ruby with a city conservatory scholarship program. When she was told Ruby was being homeschooled, she filed a wellness check request with the district. The county sent a social worker who visited our house. My mother answered the door with a staged environment, books on the table, a lesson plan by the door, for girls in matching clean clothes who answered every question in matching measured sentences. The social worker documented the visit as unremarkable and closed the file. Ms. Park called twice more. Same response. After our case broke open, investigators interviewed her. She said she had known something was wrong and had done everything the system gave her the ability to do. She asked if Ruby was okay. The investigator couldn't share that. She went back to teaching. The people who tried and were stopped by the system are not the same as the people who looked away. I want that distinction to exist somewhere in this account. My parents found the surgeon through an online forum. A closed group for parents who believed in what they called physical unification of multiple children. That phrase sounds clinical and almost academic until you understand what it means. It means surgically altering your children's bodies to make them look identical. My parents had been members for years before they found him, an American surgeon who had lost his license in the US and relocated across the border. They flew to meet him twice before booking our appointments. He examined photos they submitted. He sent back a plan with labeled diagrams: shade down Hazel's cheekbones, widen Ruby's nose, narrow Violet's, pin back my ears, alter our hairlines, reshape our lips. Then, buried near the bottom in the same clinical font as everything else, the two items my parents had not mentioned to us: rib resection on all four of us to create identical torso dimensions, and vocal cord modification to bring our voices to the same permanent pitch and tone. $20,000, paid up front by wire transfer. Surgery scheduled for 2 weeks after my 16th birthday. 1 week before we were supposed to leave, Violet swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills. She survived. The hospital asked questions about the scarring on her chest from years of binding. My parents told the doctors she had body dysmorphia. They used her suicide attempt as evidence that the surgeries were necessary. If we all looked the same, they argued, we would feel better. The social worker assigned to Violet's case requested a home visit. My parents moved up the surgery date by 3 weeks, to before the visit could happen. 3 days before we were scheduled to leave, my mother sat us down and explained the full plan for the first time, including the ribs and the vocal cords. Ruby started crying and didn't stop for 2 hours. Hazel sat with her hands in her lap and went somewhere inside herself that I couldn't reach. Violet, who had just come home from the hospital, looked out the window the entire time and said nothing. I sat there running numbers in my head, trying to find an exit, finding none. We had no money. No outside phone access. No relationships with anyone who wasn't filtered through my parents. We had been kept so thoroughly isolated that we had nothing. Or so I thought. The night before the airport, my mother stood in the kitchen and administered sleeping pills to each of us individually, watching while we swallowed. I held mine under my tongue and pressed it into my cheek. When she looked back at me, I opened my mouth to show it was empty. By 10 o'clock my sisters were deeply under. I lay in the dark listening to the house and thought about ribs and vocal cords and a surgeon who had lost his American license and the 47 accounts on that forum my mother didn't know I'd seen. I thought about Ruby's violin. I thought about Hazel's spine. I thought about Violet, 3 days home from the hospital, breathing in the next room. I did not sleep. What my parents did not know, their own surveillance system had a cloud backup server they had set up and forgotten to disable. Every recording for 18 months was stored automatically. The kitchen camera caught everything that night, including the small movement of my jaw as I pressed the pills against my cheek. Hayes's digital forensics team recovered that footage in the first hour of their search warrant. It confirmed my account completely and added drug endangerment charges by noon, because the doses my mother had given my sisters exceeded safe levels for their body weights. The van came at 4 in the morning. My father carried my sisters out one at a time. I stayed completely limp. Every instinct I had was screaming, fight, run, yell, but I had already tried running at 15, and the aftermath of that had been cameras in every room including the bathroom, locks on our doors that only worked from the outside, and homeschooling that was really just isolation with a lesson plan by the door. I had already tried that move. I needed a different one. So I stayed limp, and I counted exit signs through my barely open eyes, and I waited. The homeschooling that replaced our regular school deserves its own account, because it was not education. It was a carefully managed information environment. History was taught without context for social movements or civil rights, because those subjects are about individuals asserting themselves against systems that want to erase them, and my parents understood, consciously or not, that we were not supposed to know those stories existed. Biology was taught without puberty, an entire semester of life science, with reproduction covered in 2 sentences and everything else quietly omitted. Literature was selected exclusively for stories about teams and collectives succeeding together, never individuals breaking from the group. We had no internet access, no unsupervised contact with anyone our age. We were educated the same way we were dressed, identically, from a single source, according to a single plan. What my parents didn't anticipate was that I was educating myself in the margins. In the 60-second windows when my mother stepped out of a room and left her laptop open. In the library computer during our one supervised weekly hour. In the book she selected that sometimes contained, in footnotes and passing paragraphs, information she hadn't noticed when she approved them. I built my understanding of the outside world from fragments. Incomplete, uneven, sometimes wrong. But mine. And present. And there. The airport terminal was nearly empty. The overhead lights were brutal. My father pushed the luggage cart toward the international check-in counters while my mother walked beside us fussing over our matching hoodies, straightening our zippers, smoothing down our hair. Other travelers passed us. A woman in a business suit stopped and stared for a long moment. A man with 2 kids slowed down, looked at us, and kept walking. I watched both of them make the calculation that this wasn't their business, and I felt something I can only describe as a very cold understanding of how we had made it 10 years without anyone stopping this. The check-in agent was different. She looked up as we approached and something happened in her expression that didn't resolve back to neutral. She looked at us. Looked at her screen. Looked at us again. She typed something. Her frown deepened. She picked up the phone. A supervisor in a vest arrived. They spoke in low voices while both looking at the cart. My mother's warmest, most capable voice began, "Arts camp in Mexico, anxious flyers, mild sedative, fully doctor approved." My father smiled the smile that had redirected 100 conversations before they could become anything. I felt the moment balance on an edge. They were almost going to accept it. People almost always did, when the explanation was delivered with the right authority. I had watched it work on pediatricians and school counselors and police officers who showed up about noise complaints. It worked because my parents were good at it and because people want a simple explanation to be true. It is easier than the alternative. I lay on that luggage cart and thought about Ruby's violin, thrown in a box in the attic. I thought about Hazel waking up every morning in pain that will not fully leave her. I thought about Violet 3 days home from the hospital. I thought about the diagrams, the labeled lines across our faces showing exactly where the surgeon would cut. And I understood, with the sedative still working and the airport lights moving overhead and my parents' voices rising and falling in that practiced rhythm, that this was the last possible moment. That if I did not do something, there would be no other moment. There would just be the van to the airport and the plane to Mexico and a surgery room on the other side. And then we would come back as something we had not chosen to be, if we came back at all. I let one single tear slide down my face. Slow. Deliberate. On purpose. The most important thing I have ever done with my body. She looked up as we approached, and something happened on her face that didn't resolve back to normal. She looked at us. She looked at her screen. She looked at us again. She picked up the phone. A supervisor arrived. They spoke in low voices. My mother's warm, confident voice began, "Arts camp in Mexico, anxious flyers, a mild sedative prescribed by their doctor." My father smiled the smile that had closed 100 conversations before they could become anything. I felt the moment balance on its edge. They were almost going to accept it. People almost always did. I thought about what the surgeon's diagrams looked like. The lines drawn across our faces showing where he would cut. And I let one single tear slide down my face. Slow. Deliberate. On purpose. The agent leaned down to look at me and saw it. She grabbed the phone. Everything that followed happened fast and loud and all at once. Security, paramedics, a CPS worker named Christina Owens who arrived at a near run after someone ran my parents' names and found an open file from Violet's hospital visit 3 days earlier. The paramedics checked our pulses and our pupils and found the injection marks on our necks, fresh, red, identical marks in the same position on all 4 of us. My mother had not trusted the pills alone. She had come prepared. A security officer named Hayes crouched next to the cart, held my hand, and said quietly, "If you can hear me, squeeze." I squeezed. He went completely still for a second. Then he stood up, called for EMS, and told my parents, calmly and with total authority, that no one was boarding any plane until we had full medical clearance. My father started in on parental rights. My mother's tears started. Neither got any traction. Hayes and Christina and the paramedics and the airline supervisor were already on a different track, and there was nothing my parents could do to pull them back. Here is what my parents also didn't know. That same night their surveillance footage confirmed everything I had said. Their own records were being used as evidence against them. Because my mother kept records the way someone keeps records when they believe history will vindicate them, the measurement logs, the email thread with the clinic, the surgery diagrams, the wire transfer confirmation, all of it organized, labeled, and dated, the evidence from the house search was clean and complete. And in my bag, in the mattress lining I had transferred it to for travel, was 8 months of documentation I had built in 45-second windows when no camera was watching. The truth had a witness. It had me. The airport medical clinic was small and bright and smelled like cleaning chemicals. The forensic nurse, Albina Marr, worked through my injuries systematically and without drama, the chemical burn scars on my scalp, the friction marks on my ribs from the binding materials, the fresh injection site on my neck, the bruises on my arms from being carried. Each one photographed, each one documented. When she was done she said, "These photos will help keep you safe." That was the whole sentence. I didn't need more than that. Then Christina came in and sat down next to my bed. She explained that she was initiating emergency protective custody. We would not be going home with our parents today. I tried to answer and found I couldn't. The sedative was still working the edges of my speech, tangling the sentences before they finished. I was trying to tell her about the rib resection and the vocal cord modification and the $20,000 and the name of the clinic, and it was all coming out wrong, and I was frustrated with my own drugged brain, and then Christina took my hand and said, "You're safe. You're safe right now." I had not been told that by an adult outside my family in 10 years. Something cracked open in my chest that I hadn't known was sealed. My father's voice came through the wall from somewhere down the hall, loud, theatrical, rising toward that specific pitch that had made all 4 of us freeze since we were small. Then the hospital security guard's voice, completely unmoved. Not scared. Not backing down. Outside my door, someone was not afraid of my father. For the first time in my memory, that was true. The emergency custody hearing happened that afternoon. Christina recorded it and played it back for me in my hospital room later. My parents' lawyer argued CPS was persecuting a family for homeschooling choices and traditional values. He called the surgery plan cosmetic choices, similar to braces. He used the words religious freedom and parental authority and family autonomy like they were a wall he could build around what my parents had done. Listening to a man in a gray suit describe planned rib removal and vocal cord alteration as equivalent to teeth straightening made my hands shake. The judge went through the evidence. He didn't make a speech. He just looked at what was in front of him, the injection marks, the binding scars, the email thread with the surgeon, the diagrams, and issued the removal order. It was over by dinner. That night, from the ventilation shaft near the ceiling of my hospital room, I heard a voice calling my name. Thin and hoarse and damaged from years of forced training, but Ruby. We figured out the vents connected our rooms. We couldn't really talk, the drugs were still working on both of us, but we started tapping on the walls. 3 taps, I'm here. 2 taps, I'm scared. 4 taps, I love you. We tapped back and forth for over an hour, through hospital infrastructure, because it was what we had. Because the need to know each other is the one thing they never managed to take. I want to tell you what it felt like to be in a room by myself for the first time in 10 years. The silence was so loud it was almost physical. I kept reaching for presences that weren't there. Kept listening for breathing that matched mine. Kept almost calling out for my sisters before stopping myself. There is a particular disorientation that happens when your entire nervous system has been calibrated to the presence of 3 other people, and then those people are not there. You feel their absence the way you would feel the absence of a limb. As a ghost sensation, present and absent at the same time. When the foster family showed me to a small bedroom with pale blue walls and asked which pajamas I wanted to wear, I stood in front of that closet for 4 minutes without moving. Not because the choice was difficult. Because I had never been given one. Every choice I had made for 10 years had been the same choice as everyone else's, made simultaneously, selected from the same options. The concept of a preference I didn't need to share, that could exist as mine alone, that had no obligation to match anything outside my own head, felt like trying to recall a language I had heard once but never actually learned. I stood there for 4 minutes, and then I pointed at the middle pair, the ones with small flowers, and the foster mother smiled and left me to change. I closed the door. Stood in the room. Listened to the clock ticking downstairs, audible all the way up through the quiet. I had never heard a house this quiet before. In our house, there was always breathing nearby to monitor. Always the rhythm of 3 other people to stay calibrated to. This silence was enormous and wrong, and, underneath that wrongness, something else. Something I had never felt before in a room. Space. The silence was so loud it was almost painful. I kept reaching for presences that weren't there. When the first foster family showed me to a small room with pale blue walls and asked which pajamas I wanted to wear, I stood in front of that closet for 4 minutes without moving. Not because the choice was hard. Because I had never been given one. The concept of a preference I didn't have to share felt like trying to remember a language I'd never actually been taught. My first therapy session was with Ephraim Johnston, who didn't shake my hand when I came in, didn't promise to fix anything, and said very directly that the goal was surviving and getting through each day. He asked what I was feeling. I told him I didn't know, that everything was too mixed up to separate. He said that was exactly what we were going to work on, learning to tell one feeling from another, as if feelings were subjects you could study. That framing helped. It turned something impossible into something that had a method. 3 weeks after the airport, my sisters and I had our first supervised visit at a neutral facility. We were in the same room for 4 minutes before it fell apart. Violet said I should have stayed unconscious like everyone else and maybe we'd all still be together. I said, together meant drugged and heading for surgery. Think about what you're saying. Hazel said there was nothing to go back to. Ruby said she just wanted things to be normal again and started crying. The supervisor sat in the corner and let all of it happen. Eventually we were all crying, and then we were holding on to each other, and I realized it was the first time we had touched in weeks, the first time we had been close without being required to match. We held on for a long time. Nobody measured anything. Here is something no one had thought to tell me before the visit, that you can love your sisters and also be furious with them for a completely irrational reason. That anger and love can occupy the same moment without canceling each other out. That this is not a contradiction. That it is, in fact, just what it feels like to be a real family rather than a performed one. We had been performing a family for so long that the actual experience of one, messy, contradictory, sometimes ugly, felt like a malfunction. Ephraim would later tell me that was exactly backward. The mess was the proof it was real. Here is something no one had thought to tell me before the visit, that you can love your sisters and also be furious with them for a completely irrational reason. That anger and love can occupy the same moment. That this is not a contradiction. That it is, in fact, just what it feels like to be a real family, rather than a performed one. The first supervised visit with our parents came 4 months after the airport. Small room, cameras, a trained monitor at a table by the door. My mother started crying the second she saw us. My father's voice broke on our names. They said they were sorry. They said they had only wanted us to be special. My mother reached for my hand. I pulled back, something I had practiced in therapy because the instinct was still to let her take it. We need you to accept responsibility for what you did before we can talk about what comes next, I said. Violet, the surgeries would have hurt us permanently. Hazel, my spine is damaged. I wake up in pain every few days. Ruby touched her throat without saying anything. Just held her hand there. Our parents' faces went through something I hadn't seen before, genuine surprise that we would hold a position and not move from it. The monitor said time was up. We walked out. I felt everything at once on the way to the car, and I let all of it be present, because Ephraim had taught me, feelings don't dissolve faster when you suppress them. They just go underground until they can't. The second supervised visit was different. My mother arrived with a 12-page letter the monitor had reviewed and permitted her to share. It described her own childhood, her mother's strictness, the way she had absorbed values about conformity and obedience without ever questioning whether they were true. She wrote about genuine belief that she was protecting us. About fear, specifically the fear of watching 4 daughters grow into 4 different people in a world she believed would be cruel to each of them in different, particular ways, and how making us identical had felt, to her, like armor. I read all 12 pages of the visitation table with her sitting across from me. When I finished, she was watching me with something on her face that was the closest thing to real I had ever seen from her. Not performance. Not strategy. Just her, waiting. I told her I understood that she had been afraid. I told her fear did not excuse what she had done. I told her the armor she thought she was building was the thing that was hurting us. She started crying, not the strategic airport tears. Different ones. I held my own hands in my lap and let her cry. When the monitor said time was up, I stood and left, and I let that be enough for that day. Small room, cameras, a trained monitor at a table by the door. My mother started crying the second she saw us. My father's voice broke on our names. They said they were sorry. They said they had only wanted us to be special. My mother reached for my hand. I pulled back, something I had practiced in therapy because the instinct was still to let her take it. We need you to accept responsibility for what you did before we can talk about what comes next, I said. Violet, the surgeries would have hurt us permanently. Hazel, my spine is damaged. I wake up in pain. Ruby touched her throat without saying anything. Held her hand there for a moment. Our parents' faces went through something I hadn't seen before, genuine surprise that we would hold a position and not move. The monitor said time was up. We walked out. I felt everything on the way to the car, and I let all of it be there, because Ephraim had taught me, feelings don't go away faster when you suppress them. They just get quieter until they can't. The contempt charge against my father for the social media message opened up something unexpected. When investigators served the citation, they executed a secondary warrant on his personal devices, and on his laptop, they found 2 years of communications with the forum administrator. My father had not just participated in that community. He had been one of its founding members. He had helped draft its guidelines. He had personally introduced my mother to the surgeon whose name was in the indictment. He had not joined a system. He had helped build one. The DA's office added conspiracy charges. My parents' lawyer filed 4 motions to suppress evidence and lost 3 of them. At the final hearing, my father sat at the table looking like a smaller version of the person I had grown up with, the charm entirely absent, with nowhere useful to go. My mother held her composure through most of it, which was the more frightening version of her. Some people break when they're caught. She recalibrated. She was already writing a new version of the story in her head, one where she was still the most devoted mother in the room, still misunderstood, still eventually going to be vindicated. I don't know if she will ever find a version that includes the truth. I have stopped waiting to find out. When investigators served the citation, they executed a secondary warrant on his personal devices, and on his laptop, they found 2 years of communications with the forum administrator. My father had not just participated in that community. He had been one of its early members. He had helped write its guidelines. He had personally introduced my mother to the surgeon whose name was in the indictment. He had not joined a system. He had helped build one. The DA's office added conspiracy charges. My parents' lawyer filed 4 motions to suppress evidence. He lost 3 of them. At the final hearing, my father sat at that table looking like a smaller version of the person I had known, the charm entirely absent, nowhere useful to put it. My mother held her composure through most of it, which was the more frightening version of her. Some people break when they're caught. She recalibrated. She was already writing a new version of the story in her head, a version where she was still the protagonist, still misunderstood, still the most devoted mother in the room. I don't know if she'll ever find a version that includes the truth. I have stopped waiting. 2 months after the forum investigation expanded, Detective Reeves came back with an update. 47 accounts. 7 different countries. What my parents had participated in was not a quirk or an isolated fixation. It was an organized community with a vocabulary, a history, and rationalizations its members had refined together over years. The surgeon was the point of implementation, but not the origin. Reeves told me the community was still active, migrating to new platforms under new names. He said this as a fact, without softening it, and I appreciated that. What I understood from that conversation, and have thought about many times since, is that the things that happened to us were not an aberration. They were a point on a spectrum that begins somewhere ordinary. In a small insistence on conformity. In the cumulative erosion that happens when someone decides that a child's difference is a problem to correct rather than a person to know. That is where it begins. And recognizing where something begins is the only way to stop it before it reaches the end. The extended custody hearing came in February. Cold morning. Wood-paneled courtroom. Buzzing fluorescent lights. My parents at a table across the room from me. When I walked in, my mother started crying. I looked at the judge's desk and did not look back. I was sworn in. I started talking. And there is something I want to tell you about what that moment felt like that I have not described yet. I had been in official spaces since the airport, the clinic, the hospital, the visitation center, the temporary hearings, but a courtroom is different in a specific way. It is designed to make what happens inside feel permanent. Bridget had prepared me for the cross-examination, had walked me through the layout, had told me to breathe before each answer. What she hadn't been able to prepare me for was what it felt like to say these things out loud in a room where the job of everyone present was to listen and record them. I had known this story for years. I had lived it, documented it, carried it. But saying it officially, with my parents 10 feet away and a judge taking notes and a court reporter capturing every word, was the first time it existed anywhere outside my own body. It had weight in the room. It was real in a way it hadn't been before. That distinction matters more than I can find words for, and my voice shook for 2 minutes, and then it steadied, exactly as Bridget had said it would, once I got to the part one knew by heart. I told the judge about the cameras in every room, including the bathroom. The locks that only worked from the outside. The measurement logs tracking our hair down to the millimeter for 10 years. Violet binding her chest until she passed out in front of 30 classmates. The chemical burns on our scalps. Ruby's platform shoes and her swollen ankles. Hazel's spine. The night before the airport. The syringe. When I reached the surgical plan, the rib resection, the vocal cord modification, the labeled diagrams of our faces showing exactly where he would cut, I watched the judge's expression shift. Just slightly, around his eyes. The look of someone absorbing something that resists being absorbed. The cross-examination was designed to make me doubt my own memory. The lawyer suggested I had manipulated my sisters. That I had exaggerated the surgical plans. That what I had experienced as control was actually an intensive parenting style motivated by deep love. He said all of this in a warm, smooth, perfectly reasonable tone. I looked directly at him and I gave him the clinic's name, Centro de Modificación Estética. The exact wire transfer amount. The date it cleared. The 4 procedures by their medical names. His expression shifted. He tried 2 more questions. He got 2 more specific answers with dates and amounts attached. He sat down. Albina Marr testified as the medical expert. She was precise, clinical, and completely without performance. She presented photographs of the binding scars, the chemical burns, the injection marks, the early spinal damage in Hazel's imaging, the vocal cord changes in Ruby's throat. She gave each injury its medical name and its prognosis. She did not need to be emotional about it. The facts were doing that work on their own. Hayes testified after her, walking through the airport sequence step by step, then the house search, then the digital forensics, including the surveillance footage of my mother with the syringe and the separate camera angle that caught the small movement of my jaw. At one point Hayes mentioned how many people had seen us over the years, teachers, neighbors, church members, and had found our uniformity charming. Multiple witnesses described the family dynamic as admirable, he said. No one reported concern. The judge wrote something down that took a while to write. The ruling, extended removal for 1 full year. Required psychological evaluations for both parents before custody could be reconsidered. Supervised contact only, monitored, at approved facilities. An injunction barring either parent from making any decision about our bodies, our medical care, or our appearance for the duration of the protective order. I sat in that chair and felt relief so complete it was almost physical. And then, underneath it, the grief, because they were still my parents, complicated and real and permanent in my chest, and the court order did not change what I still felt for them even after everything they had done. Both things were true. They are still both true. 8 months after the airport, Christina called me on a Tuesday while I was eating cereal. The surgeon had been located. He had moved his clinic to a region with less regulatory oversight and was still advertising through the same closed forums as before. But the federal flag and the international database had triggered a joint investigation across 3 agencies and 2 countries, and when they found him, they found records, organized, labeled, meticulous, Because he also was the kind of person who kept records when he believed history would vindicate him, documenting 17 other families who had paid for similar procedures on their children over the previous 4 years. Some of those children had already had surgeries before the investigation reached them. My journal and the clinic emails from my mother's phone were cited in the indictment as the original source evidence that initiated the investigation. Christina said, "You started this." I sat with that for a while. The weight of it wasn't pride, it was something more like the feeling of a debt you didn't choose being paid anyway. Then I finished the cereal. Then I went to soccer practice, because I had soccer practice, and going was one of the things I had decided I was going to keep doing regardless of what else was happening. Detective Reeves came back 2 months later with a fuller update. The 47 accounts from the forum included users in 7 different countries. What my parents had participated in was not an isolated fixation. It was an organized community with a vocabulary, a history, and a shared set of rationalizations its members had been refining together for years. The surgeon was the point of implementation, not the origin. The community was still active, migrating to new platforms under new names. Reeves told me this without softening it, as a fact. What I understood in that moment, and have thought about many times since, is that the things that happened to us were not an aberration. They were a point on a spectrum. That spectrum has a far end that most people never approach, but it begins somewhere ordinary. In a small insistence on conformity. In the gradual erosion that happens when someone decides a child's difference is a problem to correct rather than a person to know. Understanding where something begins is the only way to recognize it before it reaches the far end. The surgeon had been located. He had moved his clinic to a region with less oversight and was still operating through the same forums. But the federal flag had triggered a joint investigation across 3 agencies and 2 countries. When they found him, they found records, organized, detailed, meticulous, of 17 other families who had paid for similar procedures on their children over 4 years. Some of those children had already had surgeries before the investigation reached them. My journal and the clinic emails from my mother's phone were cited in the indictment as the original source evidence. Christina said, "You started this." I sat with that for a while. Then I finished the cereal. Then I went to soccer practice. Here's what I have learned about the neighbor who used the word cute. She was not cruel. She gave us full-size Halloween candy. She waved from her yard. She was a perfectly ordinary person who looked at 4 girls always in matching clothes, always walking in line, always together, always identical, and ran it through her framework for normal and found it charming. Quirky. A little different. Cute. The thing that allowed my parents to operate for 10 years inside a neighborhood of ordinary decent people was not that those people were indifferent. It was that they were looking and seeing something their framework for normal had no category for. Control that presents as love, as a family's distinctive identity, as dedicated parenting, does not trigger the alarm that a neighbor knows how to name. It triggers something softer. Mild admiration, sometimes. A little envy for a family that seems so unified. I want to say directly to anyone watching this, when children are too identical, too quiet, too always together, too uniform, that is worth a question. Not an accusation. Just a question. A question costs nothing. The cost of not asking it is something else entirely. I signed up for a community soccer clinic that met Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Borrowed cleats that didn't fit right, shorts that were actually mine, 0 skill, 0 history. First practice, tripped over the ball twice before making contact once, then kicked it in the wrong direction. The coach said nothing except to note my approach needed adjustment. When I ran down the field chasing a ball I had no chance of catching, with no one beside me requiring me to match their speed, with no rhythm I had to calibrate to accept my own, something released in my chest. Something that had been held for 10 years went loose. I was bad at this. specifically, individually, on my own bad at it, and no one else's performance was affected by mine, and I could not drag anyone down with me. The bad at it belonged entirely to me. That night I understood, for the first time, why Ephraim said identity had to be discovered rather than assigned. You don't find out who you are by being told. You find out by doing something alone and seeing what comes back. 4 months after the airport, Christina found a foster family willing to take all 4 of us. A couple in their 50s. Enough bedrooms. Experience with sibling groups. We moved in on a Saturday. The first night, despite having our own rooms for the first time in our lives, we all ended up on the living room floor because the separate rooms felt too empty and wrong. The foster parents brought blankets. They didn't send us back. They put the TV on low and let us sort it out. Ephraim started group sessions at the house twice a week. First exercise, choose a snack from the pantry. All 4 of us reached for the same box of crackers at the same moment and stopped. We stood there staring at our own hands. Then we each went back and chose something different. It took me 11 minutes to decide between chips and an apple. I kept watching what my sisters were picking and having to redirect my hand back to myself. When we sat down with 4 different snacks and 4 different drinks, the foster father said it was the bravest thing he'd seen in a long time. Ruby held up her grape juice like a toast. We laughed. Ruby's laugh got a little unsteady. We let it be unsteady, and then it steadied again, and we all kept eating. Hazel started drawing during those months. Not because anyone suggested it. The foster mother had left a sketchbook on the kitchen table one afternoon with some pencils, no explanation, just there if anyone wanted it. Hazel picked it up 2 days later and didn't put it down for 3 hours. She drew structures, buildings, bridges, the way forces and angles and materials interact to hold weight. When Ephraim saw the drawings, he said they were unusually precise for someone without formal training. Bridget included it in her next report to the court. Hazel's individual education plan was adjusted to include an architecture elective at the community college. She was 16 when she walked into that classroom for the first time. For her first assignment, she built a bridge that held 4 people when only 3 were required. The instructor said she had good instincts. She came home and told us about it at dinner, just told the story like a person who had a day that belonged to them. That sound, someone describing something that is specifically and only theirs, still gets me sometimes. The foster mother had left a sketchbook on the kitchen table one afternoon, just there, no explanation. Hazel picked it up 2 days later and didn't put it down for 3 hours. She drew structures, buildings, bridges, the way forces and angles interact to hold weight. Her education plan was eventually adjusted to include an architecture elective at a community college. For her first assignment, she built a bridge that held 4 people when only 3 were required. The instructor said she had good instincts. She came home and told us about it at dinner, just described her day like a person who had a day that belonged to her. That sound, a person talking about something that is specifically theirs, still gets me sometimes. Ruby's voice came back in stages, the way things come back when they have been genuinely damaged rather than just temporarily disrupted. The range returned first, the ability to move up and down the register without notes collapsing. Then the clarity, the edges of words sharpening again instead of blurring. Then, about 9 months after the airport, what her ENT called her natural resonance, the specific quality that makes a voice sound like a particular person and no one else. He said it wasn't complete, that some of what the forced training had done was permanent, but that what had come back was enough to work with. Enough to sing with. The range returned first, then the clarity, then, about 9 months after the airport, what her ENT called natural resonance, the specific quality that makes a voice sound like a particular person and no one else. He said it wasn't complete, that some of what the forced training had done was permanent, but that what had returned was enough to work with. The first time Ruby sang at full voice in the Foster house, a piece she had learned at 11, before they took the violin, Hazel walked in from the other room and stood in the doorway without moving. Violet went quiet on the other side of the wall. I was in the kitchen and froze with a cup of tea halfway to my mouth. None of us said anything. When Ruby stopped, there was silence. Then Hazel said, in a voice that cracked slightly, "There you are." Ruby laughed. Then we were all laughing and then crying, and the foster parents appeared in the doorway, and the foster mother looked at the situation for about 3 seconds and went to put the kettle on. Some moments call for tea rather than intervention. At our 1-year mark, Bridget organized a review meeting at the foster house. Not a court hearing, just the 8 of us around the kitchen table, the 4 of us with Bridget and Ephraim and Christina and the foster parents. Bridget asked each of us to name one thing that was different now from a year ago. Violet said she had started talking at a normal volume again without automatically monitoring herself for cameras in the corners. She had told a joke last week that made the foster dad laugh hard enough to put down his coffee, and the feeling of saying something and having it land the way she intended, was something she had not had in years. Hazel said she had learned that the interest she had carried quietly for years, while not being allowed to pursue it, was something she was actually capable of. That knowing that felt like having a foundation under her feet for the first time. Ruby said she had sung. Just that. Her voice, hers, and someone had listened. I said I had found out my natural running pace was faster than I had ever known. When I was not adjusting my speed to match anyone else, I was fast. Not exceptional. Just faster than I had ever been allowed to discover. Bridget wrote all of it down. The foster mother refilled everyone's coffee without asking. We sat there, 4 separate people who had chosen to be in the same room. That is still the image I return to when I need to remember what all of it was for. At the foster house. Just the 8 of us around the kitchen table, the 4 of us, Bridget, Ephraim, Christina, the foster parents. Bridget asked each of us to name one thing that was different now from a year ago. Violet said she had started talking at a normal volume again without automatically checking the corners for cameras. She had told a joke last week that made the foster dad laugh hard enough to put down his coffee. Hazel said she had learned that the interest she had carried quietly for years, while not being allowed to pursue it, was something she was actually capable of. Ruby said she had sung. Just that. Her voice, hers, and someone had listened. I said I had found out my natural running pace was faster than I knew. When I wasn't adjusting my speed to match anyone else, I was fast. Not exceptional. Just faster than I had ever been allowed to discover. Bridget wrote all of it down. The foster mother refilled the coffee. We sat there, 4 separate people who had chosen to be in the same room. That is still the image I go back to when I need to remember what we were working toward. Here is what I have never stopped thinking about, regarding the neighbor who used the word cute. She was not a cruel person. She gave us full-size Halloween candy. She waved from her yard when she saw us. She was a perfectly ordinary person who observed 4 girls always dressed identically, always walking in line, always synchronized, always together, and processed it through her existing framework for normal, and found it charming. Quirky. Distinctive. Cute. The thing that allowed my parents to operate for 10 years in a neighborhood of ordinary decent people was not indifference. It was that people were looking and seeing something their framework for normal had no category for. Control that presents itself as love, as a family's unique identity, as dedicated and committed parenting, does not trigger the alarm signal that a neighbor or a teacher knows how to recognize and name. It triggers something softer. Mild admiration, sometimes. Even a little envy for a family that seems so unified and purposeful. I am telling you this not to assign blame to bystanders, but because I think it is the most important thing in this entire account. When you see children who are too identical, too quiet, too always together, too uniform, that is worth a question. Not an accusation. Not a confrontation. A question. A question costs nothing and takes 30 seconds. The cost of not asking it is something else entirely. Weeks after the case settled, a card arrived at the Foster house with no return address, a mail truck on the front and handwriting I didn't recognize. I hope you and your sisters are safe. I thought about you all a great deal. I didn't do enough soon enough, but I did what I could when I finally understood. Your mail carrier. I stood in the kitchen holding it for a long time. Our mail carrier had been delivering to our street for 11 years. She had watched us walk in formation and wear matching clothes and never quite meet anyone's eyes at the mailbox. She had written my name down in a small notebook once and said she would remember it. She had filed a report that hadn't been enough and had kept calling until there was nothing more she could do. And then, when it was over, she had found a way to tell me she had been there. I sat down and wrote back. I told her she had done something, and something had been enough. I meant it when I wrote it. I still mean it now. I'm not going to tell you everything is fine now, because it isn't. Violet is still in an intensive program. I haven't been able to hug her in months, only letters. Hazel wakes up with back pain 3 or 4 mornings a week and probably will for the rest of her life. Ruby's voice has improved significantly, but her ENT says it may never fully return to what it was before the forced training. I still have the chemical burn scars along my hairline. I still have nightmares where I'm in the van watching exit signs and can't tell if my sisters are breathing. I still sometimes reach for the same thing my sisters are reaching for before I catch myself and redirect my hand back to myself. That reflex runs deeper than thought. It may never fully disappear. But I went to soccer practice last Tuesday and scored an actual goal, and my foster dad cheered so loud the neighbors came out. Ruby played a full recital piece last month and cried at the end, good crying, the kind that empties you instead of filling you. Hazel got her hair cut really short, buzzed on the sides the way she always wanted, and stood in front of the mirror for a while just looking at her own face. I walked into a drugstore 5 months after the airport and bought pads without hiding them under anything else. The cashier rang them up like it was normal. It was normal. I texted my sisters a meme about cramps on the way home, and all 3 of them responded at completely different times with completely different reactions, because they are 3 different people who have 3 different responses to the same information, and that is allowed now, permanently, by court order and by choice. 3 months after the airport, I found a photograph at the bottom of a donated clothes bag, tucked inside a folded sweater, gotten there by accident. 4 little girls who looked like 4 different people. Curly hair, straight hair. One taller, one smaller. Different colored shirts. Different smiles. I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. The girl with the gap in her front teeth was me. I stared at that photograph for a long time, trying to remember who she was. What she liked. What made her specifically different from her sisters. But the memories were buried under too many years of systematic sameness. I couldn't reach her. I put the photo in my nightstand drawer because looking at it hurt too much, but I couldn't throw it away either. I brought it to Ephraim. He held it for a moment without speaking. Then he set it down on the table between us and said, "That girl is still in there. That is who we are looking for." I kept the photograph. I still have it. I look at it on the hard days. I think, there she is. We are finding our way back to each other. At the bottom of a donated clothes bag, tucked inside a folded sweater, gotten there by accident. 4 little girls who looked like 4 different people. Curly hair, straight hair. One taller, one smaller. Different colored shirts. Different smiles. I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. The girl with the gap in her front teeth was me. I stared at that photograph for a long time trying to remember who she was, what she liked, what made her different from her sisters, and found I couldn't reach her. The memories were buried under too many years of systematic sameness. I brought the photograph to Ephraim. He held it without speaking. Then he set it down on the table between us and said, "That girl is still in there. That is who we are looking for." I kept the photograph. I still have it in my nightstand. I look at it sometimes when the recovery feels slow. I look at it and think, there she is. We are finding our way back to each other. My parents made a fundamental error. They believed that if we were identical on the outside, they could control who we were on the inside. 10 years of systematic effort to collapse 4 people into one thing. What they created instead, accidentally, against every intention they had, was 4 people who understand at a cellular level what it costs to deny someone their own life. 4 people who will recognize that cost anywhere they encounter it. 4 people who know, now, the difference between love and control, because they spent years living inside the confusion between the two. You can take a person's name and replace it with their sister's. You can take their voice and replace it with training. You can take their ribs, if someone lets you, and reshape what's inside them. But there is a part of a person that knows the difference between who they are and who they have been required to be. That part does not negotiate. It does not adapt. It waits. It waited on a luggage cart at 4 in the morning with a sedative in my neck and airport lights moving overhead. It waited until the one moment when it could make itself visible, and then it made itself visible. 1 tear. 1 squeeze of a thumb. The 16-year-old who did both of those things had been waiting her entire life to find out what she was capable of. Now she knows.